The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
I presume everyone has an urgent question to ask. Maybe I'll have to point to someone.
One over there.
Oh, good.
So I don't remember if that's exactly what's it, but you said that maybe like the decay lines are associated to the glia cells. Is that right?
Oh, I don't want to speculate on how the brain works because there's this huge community of neuroscientists who write papers about, and they're very strange papers because they talk about how maybe it's not the neuron, and I just downloaded a long paper by someone whose name I won't mention about the idea that a typical neuron has 100,000 connections, and so something awesomely important must go on inside the neuron's body. And it's got all these little fibers and things. And presumably, if it's dealing with 100,000 signals or something, then it must be very complicated. So maybe the neuron isn't smart enough to do that. So maybe the other cells nearby that support the neurons and feed them and send chemicals to and fro around there have something to do with it. How many of you have read such articles? It's a very strange community because I think the problem is that history of that science started, first it was generally thought that all the neurons were connected. And then around 1890 was the first clear idea that nerve cells weren't arranged in a continuous network. I think it was generally believed that they were all connected to each other because, as far as you could tell with the microscopes of the time, it didn't show enough. And then the hypothesis that the neurons are separate and there are little gaps called synapses, as far as I can tell, started around the 1890s. And from then on, as far as I can see, neurology and psychology became more and more separate. And the neurologists got obsessed with chemicals, hormones, epinephrine, and there are about a dozen chemicals involved that you can detect when parts of the brain are activated. And so a whole bunch of folklore grew up about the roles of these chemicals. And one thought of some chemicals as inhibitory and excitatory. And that idea still spreads, although what we know about the nervous system now, and I think I mentioned this before, is that in general, if you trace a neural pathway from one part of the brain to another, what happens is that the connections tend to alternate. Not always, but frequently, so that this connection might inhibit this neuron, and then you look at the output of that neuron, and that might tend to excite neurons in the next brain center, and then most of those cells would tend to inhibit. Each brain center gets inputs from several others, and so it's not that a brain center is excitatory or inhibitory, but the connections from one brain center to another tend to have this effect. And that's probably necessary from a systems dynamic point of view. Because if all neurons tended to either do nothing or excite the next brain center, then what would happen? As soon as you got a certain level of excitement, then more and more brain centers would get activated and the whole thing would explode. And that's more or less what happens in an epileptic seizure, where if you get enough electrical and chemical activity of one kind or another, mostly electrical, I think, but I don't know, then whole large parts of the brain start to fire synchronously, and the thing spreads like very much like a forest fire. So that's a long rant. I guess I've repeated it several times, but it's hard to communicate with that community because they really want to find the secret of thinking and knowledge in the brain cells rather than in the architecture of the interconnections. So my inclination is to find an intermediate level, such as, at least in the cortex, which is what distinguishes the... Does it start in mammals?
I think so.
I think if I'm, rather than a neurology book, I'm thinking of Carl Sagan's book, which there's a sort of triune theory that's very popular, which is that the brain consists of three major divisions, and I forget what the lowest level one is called, but the middle level is sort of the amphibian and then the mammalian, and it's in the mammalian development that that large parts of the brain are cortex. And the cortex isn't so much like a tangled neural net, but it's divided mainly into columns. So, and each column, these vertical columns, tend to have 6 or 7 layers. I think 6 is the standard. And the whole thing is, what is it, about 4 or 5 millimeters thick, maybe a little more. And in each of these columns, there's major columns which have about 1,000 neurons, and one of these columns is made of maybe 10 or 20 of these mini columns that have 50 or 100 or whatever. And so my inclination is to suspect that since these are the animals that think and plan many steps ahead and do all the sorts of things we take for granted in humans, that we want to look there for the architecture of memory and problem-solving systems. In the animals without cortexes, you can account for most of their behavior in terms of fairly low-level immediate stimulus response reflexes and large major states, like turning on some big blocks of these reflexes when it's hungry, and turn on other blocks when there's a environmental threat and so forth, or whatever. Anyway, I forget what, yes?
So in chapter 3, you talked about like the stages we go through when we face something like your car breaks down and you can go to work. That's the example given in the book. I'm wondering, how do you decide that we, transition from one stage to another, and why do we go through the stages of denial, bargaining, like frustration, depression, and then only the last stage seems productive. I guess my main question is, how do we decide that we should transition from one stage to another? What marks the end, and why do we start it?
That's a beautiful question. I think it's fairly well understood in the invertebrates that there are different centers in the brain for different activities. And I'm not sure how much is known about how these things switch. How does an animal decide whether it's time to, for example, most animals are either diurnal or nocturnal. So some stimulus comes along like it's getting dark, and a nocturnal animal might then start waking up, and it turns on some part of the brain, and it turns off some other parts, and it starts to sneak around looking for food or whatever it does at night. Whereas a daily animal, when it starts to get dark, that might trigger some brain center to turn on, and it looks for its place to sleep and goes and hides. So some of these are due to external things. Then, of course, there are internal clocks. So for lots of animals, if you put it in a box that's dimly illuminated, and it has a 24-hour cycle of some sort, it might persist in that cycle for quite a few days and go to sleep every 24 hours for half the time and so on. A friend of mine once decided he would see about this, and it's a famous AI theorist named Ray Solomonoff, and he put black paint on all his windows and found that he had a 25 or 26 hour natural cycle, which was very nice. And this persisted for several months. I had another friend who lived in the New York subways because his apartment was in a building that had an entrance to the subway, and he stayed out of daylight for 6 months. But anyway, he too found that he preferred to be on a 25 or 26 hour day than 24. I'm rambling, but we apparently have several different systems. So there's dead reckoning system where some internal clocks are regulating your behavior, and then there are other systems where people are very much affected by the amount of light and so forth. So we probably have 4 or 5 ways of doing almost everything that's important. And then people get various disorders where some of these systems fail and a person doesn't have a regular sleep cycle, and there are disorders where people fall asleep. What's it called when you fall asleep every few minutes? Narcolepsy. And all sorts of wonderful disorders, just because the brain has evolved so many different ways of doing anything that's very important. Yeah.
Can you describe the best piece of criticism for the Society of Mind theory?
Best piece of what?
The best criticism.
Oh. It reminds me of an article I recently read about the possibility of a virus for, what's the disorder where? No, actually, there isn't any generally accepted cause for Alzheimer's, as far as I know. Is it? What?
Somebody did an experiment where they injected Alzheimer-infected matter into someone, and they got the same plaque.
Oh, well, right. I wonder if that's a popular theory. No, what's the one where people... say it again?
Fibromyalgia.
Yes, right. That's right, which is not recognized by most theorists to be a definite disease. But there's been an episode in which somebody, I forget what her name is, was pretty sure that she had found a virus for it. And every now and then somebody revives that theory and tries to get more evidence for it. Anyway, there must be disorders where the programming is bad rather than a biochemical disorder, because whatever the brain is, it's the adult brain is certainly has a very large component of what we would, in any other case, consider to be software, namely lots of things that you've learned, including ways for one part of the brain to discover how to modulate or turn on or turn off other parts of the brain. And since we've only had this kind of cortex for 4 or 5 million years, it's probably still got lots of bugs. Evolution never knows what. When you make a new innovation, you don't know what's going to come after that might find bugs and ways to get short-range advantages, short-term advantages, at the expense of longer-term advantages. So lots of mental diseases might be software bugs, and a few of them are known to be connected to, abnormal secretions of chemicals and so forth. But even in those cases, it's hard to be sure that the overproduction or underproduction of a neurologically important chemical is what should I call it, a biological disorder or a functional disorder, because some part of the nervous system might have found some trick to cause abnormal secretions of some substance. That's the sort of thing that we can expect to learn a great deal more about in the next generation because of the lower cost and greater resolution of brain scanning techniques and what's his name, and new synthetic ways of putting in fluorescent chemicals into a normal brain without injuring it much, so that you can now do sort of macrochemical experiments of seeing what chemicals are being secreted in the brain with new kinds of scanning techniques. So neuroscience is going to be very exciting in the next generation with all the great new instruments. As you know, my complaint is that somehow introduction to the... I'm not saying any of the present AI theories have been confirmed to tell you that the brain works as such and such a rule-based system or such and such a... or use Winston-type representations or Roger Schank-type representations or scripts or frames or whatever. And the next to last chapter of the emotion machine sort of summarizes, I think, almost a dozen different AI theories of ways to represent knowledge. Nobody has confirmed that any of those particular ideas are represent what happens in a mammalian brain. And the problem is that to me, is that the neuroscience community just doesn't read that stuff and doesn't design experiments to look for them. David has been moving from computer science and AI into that. So he's my current source of knowledge about what's happening there. Have any of you been following contemporary neuroscience? That's strange. Yeah.
So, you will talk about software a little bit. Like, so I think they like analyze Einstein brain and realize like that's why I talk about the glia cells, and maybe like he had a lot more glia cells than normal humans, and so do you believe that the intelligence of humans is like more on the software side or on the hardware side? Like, we have computers that are very, very powerful. Could we create software that, like, we can run these machines that reproduce in, like, humans? Like, yeah.
I don't see any reason to doubt it. As far as we know, computers can simulate anything. What they can't do yet, I suppose, is simulate large-scale quantum phenomena, because if you know the Feynman theory of quantum mechanics, is that if you have a network of physical systems that are connected, then it's in the nature of physics that whatever happens from one state to another in the real universe, whatever happens actually happens by the wave function. The wave function represents the sum of the activities propagating through all possible paths. So in some sense, that's too exponential to simulate on a computer. In other words, we can, I believe the biggest supercomputers can simulate a helium atom today fairly well, but they can't simulate a lithium atom because it's sort of 4 or 5 layers of exponentiation. Difference between 2 to the 2 to the 2 to the 2 and 4 to the 4 to the 4 to the 4. It gets, those numbers get out of hand. But I suspect that the reason the brain works is that it's evolved to prevent quantum effects from making things complicated. The great thing about a neuron is that, generally speaking, a neuron fires all or none, and you get this point. You actually get a full half volt of potential between the neurons' fiber and the surrounding fluid, and that's a half a volt is a big difference. Yeah.
So, like, do you believe that the software that we have right now is equivalent to, for example, the intelligence that we have, like, in dogs or, for example, simple animals? Is, like, the difference that, like, do we just need to implement the software, like modify the software, or somehow we need to create a whole different software that...
No, there doesn't seem to be much difference in the architecture of, in the local architecture of...
Turn the microphone. The one on the bottom.
Oh, can I turn it off?
Yes.
It's not green.
Yeah, so throw the switch. Is it green now?
Now it's green.
Okay, good.
The difference between the dog and a person is the huge frontal cortex. I think the rest of it is fairly similar. And I presume the hippocampus and amygdala and the structures that control which parts of the cortex are used for what are somewhat different. But the small details of all mammalian brains are practically the same. I mean, basically, you can't make an early genetic change in how neurons work, or all the brain cells of the offspring would be somewhat different, and the thing would be dead. So evolution has this property that generally there are only two places in the development of an embryo that evolution can operate. Namely, in the pre-placental stage, you can change the way the egg breaks up and evolves, and you can have amazing things like identical twins happen without any effect on the nature of the adult offspring. Or you can change the things that happen most recently in evolution, like little tweaks in how some part of the nervous system works, if it doesn't change earlier stages. However, mutations that operate in the middle of all that and change the number of segments in the embryo, I guess you could have a longer tail or a shorter tail, and that won't affect much. But if you change the 12 segments of the spine that the brain develops from, you'd get a huge alteration in how that animal will think. So we're sort of, in other words, evolution cannot change intermediate structures very much, or the animal won't live. Bob Lawler.
If one thinks of comparing a person to a dog, would it not be most appropriate to think of those persons who are like the wild boy of southern France, who grew up in the woods without any language? I would say that if you're going to look at an individual's intelligence, that would be a fair comparison with a dog. Whereas what we have when we think of people today is people who have learned so much through interaction with other people, that the transmission of culture, is it not essentially ways of thinking that have been learned throughout the history of civilization, and some of us are able to pass on to others?
Sure, although if you expose a dog to humans, it doesn't learn language. So,
May or may not come.
right. So but presumably language is fairly recent, so you could have mutations in the structure of the language centers and still have a human that's alive, and it might be better at language than most other people, or somewhat worse. So you could have lots of small mutations in anything that's been recently evolved. But the frontal cortex is, and the human cortex is really very large compared to the rest of the brain. Same in dolphins and a couple of other animals. I forget. Whales. Yeah.
So the reason why I asked that is that it seems to me that we have some quality, like some kind of, we can see the word, like add some qualities to the word, and like this is what I would call consciousness. And like for me, it seems that dogs also have this quality of like seeing the word and like adding qualities to the word. So like maybe this is good, this is bad. Like there are different qualities for different beings. And like the software that we produce right now seems to be maybe faster and like maybe do more tasks than what maybe a dog does. But for me, it doesn't seem that it has essential this like quality thing. Like it doesn't have consciousness in the sense. It doesn't like aggregate quality to the things in the world. Maybe.
Well, I think I know what you're getting at, but you're using that word consciousness, which I've decided to abandon because it's 36 different things, and probably a dog has 5 or 6 of them, or 31, I don't know. But one question is, do you think a dog can think several steps ahead and consider 2 alternative? That's funny. Oh, let's make this abstract. So here's a world, and the dog is here, and it wants to get here, and there are all sorts of obstacles in it. So can the dog say, well, if I went this way, I'd have such and such difficulty, whereas if I went this way, I'd have this difficulty. Well, I think this one looks better. Do you think your dog considers 2 or 3 alternatives and makes plans? I have no idea, but the curious thing about a person is you can decide that you're going to not act in the situation until you've considered 16 plans. And then one part of your brain is making these different approaches to the problem. And another part of your brain is saying, well, now I've made 5 plans, and I'm beginning to forget the first one, so I better reformulate it. And you're doing all of these self-conscious in the sense that you're making plans that involve predicting what decisions you will make, and instead of making them, you make the decision to say, I'm going to follow out these 2 plans and use the result of that to decide which one to. Do you think a dog does any of that? Does it look around and say, well, I could go that way or this way? I remember our dog was good at, if you throw a ball, it would go and get it. And if you threw 2 balls, it would go and get both of them. And sometimes if you threw 3 balls, it would go and get them all. And sometimes if a ball would roll under a couch that it couldn't reach, it would get the other 2, and it would think, and then it would run back to the kitchen where that ball is usually found, and then it would come back disappointed. So what does that mean? Did it have parallel plans, or does it make a new one when the previous one fails and they're not actually parallel? What's your guess? How far ahead does a dog think? Do you have a dog?
Yeah, I do have a dog, but I don't believe that's the essential part of beings that have some kind of advanced brain. We can plan ahead. Humans can plan ahead. I don't think the core, the fundamental part of intelligence. Humans, I think Winston says that humans are better than primates in they can understand stories and they can join together stories, but somehow I don't buy the story that primates are just rule planners. I believe somehow we have some quality machine of the world, and somehow we're not writing a software.
But it's funny, computer science teaches us things that weren't obvious before. It might turn out that if you're a computer and you only have 2 registers, then, well, in principle, you could do anything, but that's another matter. But it might turn out that maybe a dog has only 2 registers and a person has 4. And a trivial thing like that makes it possible to have 2 plans and put them in suspense and think about the strategy and come back and change one. Whereas if you only had 2 registers, your mind would be much lower order, and there's no big difference. So computer science tells us that the usual way of thinking about abilities might be wrong. Before computer science, people didn't really have that kind of idea. Many years ago, I was in a contest, a science, because some of our friends showed that you could make a universal computer with 4 registers. And I had discovered some other things, and I managed to show that you could make a universal computer with just 2 registers, and that was a big surprise to a lot of people. But there never was anything in the history of psychology of that nature. So there never were really technical theories of it's really computational complexity. What does it take to solve certain kinds of problems? And until the 1960s, there weren't any theories of that. And I'm not sure that that aspect of computer science has actually reached many psychologists or neuroscientists. I'm not even sure that it's relevant, but it's really interesting that the difference between 2 and 3 registers could make an exponential difference in how fast you could solve certain kinds of problems and not others. So maybe there'll be a little more mathematical psychology in the next couple of decades. Yeah.
So in artificial intelligence, how much of our effort should be devoted to kind of reflecting on our own thinking as humans and trying to figure out what's really going on inside our brains and then trying to kind of implement that versus observing and identifying what kinds of problems we as humans can solve and then come up with any sort of way for a computer to kind of in a human-like way solve these problems?
Well, there are a lot of nice questions. I don't think it doesn't make any sense to suggest that we think about what's happening in our brains, because that takes scientific instruments. But it certainly makes sense to go over older theories of psychology and ask what kinds of procedures to solve a certain kind of problem, what kind of procedures are absolutely necessary. And you could find some things like that, like how many registers would you need and what kinds of conditionals and what kind of addressing. So I think a lot of cognitive psychology, modern cognitive psychology, is of that character, but I don't see any way to introspect and well enough to guess how your brain does something, because we're just not that conscious. You don't have access to... You could think for 10 years about how do I think of the next word to speak, and unlikely that you might get some new ideas about how this might have happened, in fact, but you couldn't be sure. Well, I take it back. Probably people You could probably get some correct theories by being lucky and clever, and then you'd have to find a neuroscientist to design an experiment to see if there's any evidence for that. In particular, I'd like to convince some neurologists to consider the idea of K-lines. That's described, I think, in both of my books. And think of experiments to see if you could get them to light up or otherwise localize. And once you have in your mind the idea that maybe the way one brain sends information to another is over something like K-lines, which I think I talked about that the other day. Random superimposed coding on parallel wires, then maybe you could think of experiments that even present brain scanning techniques could use to localize these. My main concern is that the way they do brain scanning now is to set thresholds to see which brain centers light up and which turn off. And then they say, oh, I see, this activity looks like it happens in the lateral hippocampus, and because you see that light up. I think that there should be at least a couple of neuroscientist groups who do the opposite, which is to reduce the contrast, and when there are several brain centers that seem to be involved in an activity, then say something to the patient and look for one area to get 2% dimmer and another to look 4% brighter, and say that might mean that there's a K line going from this one to that one with an inhibitory effect on this or that. But as far as I know right now, every paper I've ever seen published showing brain centers lighting up has high contrast. And so they're missing all the small things. And maybe they're only seeing the end result of the process where a little thinking has gone on with all these intricate low-intensity interactions, and then the thing decides, oh, okay, I'm going to do this. And you conclude that that brain center which lit up is the one that decided to do this, whereas it's the result of a very small, fast avalanche.
Have you seen the one a couple weeks ago about reading out the visual field in real time? So,
From the visual cortex?
yes. Quite a nice hack. They aren't actually reading out the visual field. For each subject, they do a massive amount of training where they flash thousands of 1-second video clips and assemble a database of very small perturbations in different parts of the visual cortex lighting up. And then they show a novel video to each of the subjects and basically just do a linear combination of all of the videos that they had done in the training phase, weighted by how closely things line up in the brain. And you can sort of see what's going on. It's quite striking.
Can you tell what they're thinking? Or
You can only tell what they're seeing. But I think...
Yeah, if your eyes are closed, what is your primary visual cortex probably doesn't do anything, does it?
I think it's just, yeah.
But the secondary one might be representing things that might be there. Or
Yes. So the goal of the authors of this paper is eventually to literally make movies out of dreams. But that's a long way off.
it's an old idea in science fiction. How many of you read science fiction? Wow. That's a majority. Who's the best new writer?
Neil Stevenson.
He's been writing a long time.
It's new compared to Heinlein.
as I had dinner with Stevenson at the Hillis's a couple of years ago. Yeah.
One last question. So, from what I understood, it seems that you're saying that the difference between us and, like, for example, dogs is just a computational like power. So, do you believe that the difference between dogs and computers is also just computational? Like, what would be the difference between dogs and like Turing machines?
Well,
or there is no difference. It's just.
It might be that only humans and maybe some of their closest relatives can imagine a sequence. In other words, the simplest, oldest theories in psychology were the theory of, like David Hume, had the idea of association. One idea in the mind or brain causes another idea to appear in another. So that means that a brain that's learned associations or learned if-then, rule-based systems, can make chains of things. But the question is, can any animal other than humans imagine two different situations and then compare them and say, if I did this and then that, how would the result differ from doing that and then this? If you look at Jerry Sussman's thesis, if you're at MIT, a good thing to do is to read and you're taking a course, you should read the PhD thesis of your professor. It not only will help you understand better what the professor said, you'll get a higher grade if you care, and many other advantages, like you'll actually be able to talk to him and his mind won't throw up. So, I don't know if a dog can recapitulate can the dog think, I think I'll go around this fence, and when I get to this tree, I'll do this, I'll pee on it. That's what dogs do. And then whereas if I go this way, something else will happen. It might be that that primates can't do much of that. On the other hand, if you ask, what is the song of the whale? What's the whale that has this 20-minute song? I think my conjecture is that a whale has to swim 1,000 miles or several hundred miles sometimes to get the food it wants, because things change. And each group of whales, humpback whales, I guess, sing this song that's about 20 minutes long, and nobody has made a good conjecture about what's the content of that song. But it's shared among the animals, and it goes, they can hear it 20 or 50 miles away and repeat it. And it changes every season. So I suspect that the obvious thing that it should be about is where's the food these days? Where are the best flocks of fish to eat? Because a whale can't afford to swim 200 miles to the place where its favorite fish were last year and find it empty. It takes a lot of energy to cross the ocean. So maybe those animals have the ability to remember very long sequences and even some semantics connected with it. I don't know if dogs have anything like that. Do dogs ever seem to be talking to each other? Or are they just...
Oh, I have a story about dogs. So apparently in Moscow, not all dogs, but a very small fraction of the stray dogs in the city have learned how to ride the metro. They live out in the suburbs because I guess people give them less trouble when they're out in the suburbs. And then they take the subway each day into the city center where there are more people. And they have various strategies for begging in the city center. So for instance, they find some guy with a sandwich and they bark really loudly behind the guy and the guy would drop the sandwich and then they'd steal it. Or they have a pack of them and they all know each other and they send out a really cute one to beg for food, and so they'll give the cute one food and the cute one brings it back to everyone else. And simply navigating the subway is actually a bit complicated for a dog. But somehow, like, a very small group of dogs in Moscow have learned how to do it. Like, figure out where their stop is, get on, get off.
Yeah, our dog once stopped on the Green Line and got off at Park Street. So she was missing for a while, and somebody at Park Street called up and said, "Your dog is here." So I went down and got her. And the agent said, "You know, we had a dog that came to Park Street every day and changed trains and took the red line to somewhere. And finally we found out that its master it used to go to work with its owner every day, and he died. And the dog took the same trip every day. And the tea people understood that he shouldn't be bothered with. Our dog chased cars. Was it Jenny? And that was terrible because we knew she was going to get hurt. And finally a car squashed her leg and she was laid up for a while with a somewhat broken leg. And I thought, well, she won't chase cars anymore. But she did. But she didn't. What she wouldn't do is go to the intersection of Carlton and Ivy Street anymore, which is. So she had learned something. But it wasn't the right thing. I'm not sure I answered your.
Actually, according to, so there's the story that you gave in chapter 2 about the girl who's digging dirt. And, so in the case where she learns whether digging dirt is a good or bad activity is when there's somebody with whom she has an attachment bond with present, who's telling her whether it's good or bad. And in the case where she learns to avoid that spot is when something bad happens to her in the spot. So in a sense, the dog is behaving just like that logic.
Yes, the dog, except that the dog is oriented toward location rather than something else. So
about possible hierarchy of higher order representation schemes of knowledge, with like semantic nets on top and at the bottom. There's like neural network in the middle of K lines, and on the bottom there's something simpler. So the way I thought about the questions that were just asked, that humans, it seems natural to me that you need all the intermediate representations in order to support like something like semantic nets. And it seems natural to me to think that humans have all these, the whole hierarchy of representations, but dogs might have something only in the middle, like they might have something equivalent to like neural nets or something. So my question is, what behaviors that you could observe in real life could only be done with one of these intermediate representations of knowledge that can't be done with something like machine learning?
You mean machine learning of what, of some particular kind?
The kind that's currently fashionable, I think.
Kind of brute, like with like huge data set, brute force sort of calibration of some parameter. So it seems to me that if you recognize a behavior like that, it might be a worthy intermediate goal to be able to model that instead of trying to model something like natural language, which is you might need the first part to get the second part.
Well, it would be nice to know. I wonder how much is known about elephants, which are awfully smart compared to. I suspect that they are very good at making plans because it's so easy for an elephant to make a fatal mistake. So, unfortunately, it probably no research group has enough budget to study that kind of animal because it's just too expensive. How smart are elephants? Anybody? I've never interacted with one. I'm not sure if you have a question.
I think the question is, are there behaviors that you need an intermediate level of the representation of knowledge in order to perform that you don't need like the highest level, like the semantic, like basically natural language in order to do. So you could say that if I saw an animal doing this behavior, I know that it has some intermediate level of representation of knowledge that's more than kind of a brute force machine learning approach. Because like what's discussed before, a computer can do pathfinding and with just like a brute force approach, but I don't think that's how humans do it or animals do it.
Well, I can't think of a good it's just hard to think of any animals besides us that have really elaborate semantic networks. There's Coco, who's a gorilla that apparently had hundreds of words, but
I think the question is to find something that's lower than words. Like maybe Betty the Crow
with that stick.
Yeah.
How many of you seen the Crow movie? She bends she has a wire that she bends and pulls something out of a tube. But
I don't think machine learning can do that, but I don't think you need semantic maps to do it either.
I have a parrot who lives in a three-dimensional cage, and she knows how to get from any place to another. And if she's in a hurry, she'll find a new way at the risk of injuring a wing because there are a lot of sticks in the way. So flying is risky. But our daughter Julie once visited Coco, the gorilla, and she was introduced. Coco's in a cage, and Penny, who's Coco's owner, introduces Julie in sign language. Coco, it's not words, it's not spoken, it's sign language. And so Julie gets some name, and she's introduced to Coco, and Coco likes Julie, so Coco says, "Let me out." And Penny says, "No, you can't get out." And Coco says, "Then let Julie in." And I thought that showed some fairly abstract reasoning or representation. And Penny didn't let Julie in. But Coco seemed to have a fair amount of declarative syntax. I don't know if she could do passives or anything like that. If you're interested, you probably can look it up on the web. Penny thought that Coco knew 600 or 700 words. And a friend of ours was a teenager who worked for her. And what's his name? And he was convinced that Coco knew more than 1,000 words. But he said, you see, I'm a teenager and I'm still good at picking up gestures and clues better than the adults here. But anyway, I gather Coco is still there, and I don't know if she's still learning more words. But every now and then we get a letter asking to send more money. Oh, in the last lecture, I couldn't think of the right cryptarithmetic example. I think that's the one that the Newell Simon book starts out with. So obviously M is 1, and then I bet some of you could figure that out in 4 or 5 minutes. Has anybody figured it out yet? Help. Send more questions. Yeah.
I have an example of, for instance, I go out to a restaurant of this type of exotic food that I've never ever had before, and I end up getting sick from it. So what determines whether what I learn from this? Because there are many different possibilities here. There's the one possibility of I learned to avoid the specific food I ate. Another possibility is like I learned to avoid that type of food because it might contain some sort of spice that I react to badly. And the third possibility, there might be more, is like I learned to avoid that restaurant because that just might be a bad restaurant. So in this case, it's not entirely clear which one I ought to pick. And of course, maybe in real life, I might go there again and empirically try another food or try the same food at a different restaurant. But what do you think about just in that scenario? What causes people to pick which one?
The trouble is we keep thinking of ourselves as people. And what you really should think of yourself as a sort of Petri dish with a trillion bacteria in it. And it's really not important to you what you eat, but your intestinal bacteria are the ones who are really going to suffer because they're not used to anything new. So I don't know what conclusion to draw from that. But
previously you mentioned David Hume thought that knowledge might be represented as associations. And that occurs to me as being similar to sort of like a wiki structure where entries have tags. So an entry might be defined by what tags it has or what associations it has. I'm wondering if that structure has been, somebody has attempted to code that into some kind of virtual structure. Has there been any success with putting that idea into a potential AI?
I don't know how to answer that. Do any psychologists use semantic networks as representations? Pat, do you know, has anybody, I know, is anyone building an AI system with semantic representations or semantic networks anymore? Or is it all, everything I've seen has gone probabilistic in the last few years? Your project, do you have any competitors?
No.
Any idea what the IBM people are using? I saw a long article that I didn't read yet,
My
but
impression is traditional information retrieval plus 100 hacks plus machine learning.
they seem to have a whole lot of different, slightly different representations that they switch among. But
None of them are very semantic.
Well, they probably have, I don't know, does anybody know what the answer is, but they must have little frame-like things
yeah,
for the standard questions.
of course, the thing doesn't answer any, it doesn't do any reasoning as far as you can tell.
Right.
So it's trying to match sentences in the database with the question. Well, what's your theory of why there aren't other groups working on what we used to, and you are?
Well, bulldozer computing is a fad, and if you can do better in less time that way than figuring out how it really works, then that's what you do. I mean, no one does research on chess. No one does any research on how humans might play chess because the bulldozer computers have won.
Right. There were some articles on chess and checkers early in the game, but nothing recent as far as I know.
So it's a local, in many ways, it's a local maximum phenomenon. The bulldozer computing stuff has got up to a certain local maximum, and until you can do better than that some other way, no one's interested.
Well, I wonder if we could invent a new TV show where the questions are interesting. Like, I'm obsessed with the question of why you can pull something with a string, but you can't push it. And in fact, what was this? We had a student who actually did something with that a long time ago, but I've lost track of him. But how could you make a TV show that had common sense questions rather than ones about sports and actors?
Well, don't you imagine what happens when you push with a string? It's hard to explain that in
It
words, but
buckles.
it's easy to imagine.
Yeah, so you can simulate it.
Yeah.
Well, can you? Yeah.
So I have a question. So suppose in the future we can create a robot which is as intelligent as human, as smart, and how we should evaluate it? When do we know that we reach like certain thing, like which test it should pass or which question it should, I don't know. So for example, Watson, right? It can answer pretty hard questions and seem to be intelligent, but what all it is doing some algorithms and then calculating some probabilities and stuff. Humans don't do that. They try to understand the questions and they look for the answer, right? But then suppose you can create a robot that can behave as it is, like, I don't know, how would you evaluate, like, when do you know that you reach something?
That's sort of funny because you, if it's any good, you wouldn't have that question. You'd say, well, what can't it do, and why not, and you'd argue with it. In other words, people, people talk about passing the Turing test or whatever, and it's hard to imagine a machine that that you converse with for a while, and then when you're told it's a machine, you're surprised.
I think that, for example, you can make a machine to say some very intelligent and smart things because, like, it may know like all this like text information from different books and all this information it has somewhere in the database, right? But then, like, when people speak, they kind of understand what they're speaking. How do you know, like, something will understand something it doesn't understand, or does it have to understand at all?
Well, I would ask you questions like, why can't you push something with a string? And, well, anyone have a Google working? What does Google say if you ask it that? Maybe it'll quote me. Or someone who's, yeah.
How would you answer that question? Like, why you can pull but not push?
I'd say, well, it would buckle. And then they would say, what do you mean by buckle? And then I'd say, oh, it would fold up so that it got shorter without exerting any force at the end, or blah, blah. I don't know. There are lots of answers. How would you answer it? A physicist might say, if you got it really very, very, very straight, you could push it with a string. But quantum mechanics would say you can't. Yeah.
I feel like if you, like, the difficult or like an interesting show would be have like an alternate cooking show or something where you have to use objects that's like not normally found to have that use. So like you want to paint a room, but you're not given a brush. You're given like, say, a sponge, or a piece of cloth, and like eggplants. You want to paint it purple. So it has to represent the things in a different way other than like, you know.
Words.
Yeah.
That's interesting. When I was in graduate school, I took a course in knot theory. And in fact, you couldn't talk about them. And if anybody had a question, they'd have to run up to the board and, you know, they'd have to do something like this. Is that a knot? No. No, that's just a loop. Or is, but if you were restricted to words, it would take a half hour to. That's interesting. Yeah.
So, you mentioned solving the string puzzle by imagining the result, and I think I heard someone else say computers can do that in some way. You can simulate a string, and we know enough physics that you could give a reasonable approximation of the string. But I find that the question that is often not asked in AI is, or by computers, is how does one choose the correct model with which to answer questions? There's a lot of questions we're really good at answering with computers, and some of them, you know, genetic algorithms are good for, some of them Bayesian statistics, some of them formal logic, some of them physics simulation. But this is all, to me, this is the core question, because this is what people decide, and no one seems to have ever tackled in AI.
Well, for instance, you have to, if somebody asks the question, you have to make up a biography of that person, so that, because the same question from different people would get really different answers. Oh. Why does a kettle make a noise when the water boils. If you know that the other person is a physicist, and it's easy to think of things to say, but not a very good example. What's the context of that? How do you, in a human conversation, how does each person know what to say next?
I guess, one question is, how do people decide what AI methods to use to tackle a problem? And I guess the more fundamental question is, when people are solving problems, how do they decide how they're going to think about the problem? Are they going to think about it by visualizing it, think about it by trying different things, think about it by analogy or formal logic? Of all the tools we have, why do we pick the ones we do?
Yeah, well, that goes back to the, if you make a list of the 50 most common ways to think, and somebody asks you a question, or asks why does such and such happen, how do you decide which of your ways to think about it? And I suspect that that's another knowledge base. So we have common sense knowledge about, if you let go of an object, it will fall. And then we have more general knowledge about what happens when an object falls. Why didn't it break? Well, it actually did, because here's a little white thing which turned into dust. And so that's why I think you need to have 5 or 6 or how many different levels of representation. So as soon as somebody asks a question, one part of your brain is coming up with your first idea. Another part of your brain is saying, is this a question about physics or philosophy, or is it a social question? Did this person ask it because they actually want to know, or they want to trap me, or so I think generally this idea of there must be many kinds of society of mind models that people have, and each person, whenever you're talking to somebody, you choose some model of what is this conversation about? Am I trying to accomplish something by this discussion? Is it really an interesting question? Do I not want to offend with the person, or do I want to make him go away forever? And little parts of your brain are making all these decisions for you. I'd like to introduce Bob Lawler, who's visiting.
One of my favorite stories about Feynman comes from asking him at dinner one night. I asked him how he got to be so smart. And he said that when he was an undergraduate here, he would consider every time he was able to solve a problem just the beginning step of how to exploit that. And what he would then do would be to try to reformulate the problem in many different representations as he could, and then use his solution of the first problem as a guide in working out alternate representations and procedures in that. The consequence, according to him, was that he became very good at knowing which was the most fit representation to use in solving any particular problem that he encountered. And he said that that's where his legendary capability of being so quick with good solutions and good methods for solutions came from. So maybe a criterion for an intelligent machine would be one that had a number of 15 different ways of thinking and applied them regularly to develop alternative information about different methods of problem solving. You would expect it then to have some facility at choosing based on its experience.
Yeah, he wrote something about, because the other physicists would argue about whether to use Heisenberg matrices or Schrodinger's equation, and he thought he was the only one who knew how to solve each problem both ways, because most of the other physicists would get very good at one or the other. He had another feature, which was that if you argued with him, sometimes he would say, "Oh, you're right, I was wrong." Like he was once arguing with Fredkin about, could you have clocks all over the universe that were synchronized? And the standard idea is you couldn't because of relativity. And Fredkin said, well, suppose you start out on Earth and you send a huge army of little bacteria-sized clocks and send them through all possible routes to every place, and figure out and compensate for all the accelerations they had experienced on the path. Then wouldn't you get a synchronous time everywhere? And Feynman said, you're right, I was wrong, without blinking. He may have been wrong. But more questions?
His question about how do we know what method to use for solving problems. I'm kind of curious how we know what data set or what data to use when solving problems. Because like we have so much sensory input at any given moment and so much data that we have from experience. But like when you get a problem, you instantly, and I guess K-lines is sort of a solution for that. But I'd be curious how you could possibly represent good data relationships in a way that a computer might be able to use. Because like right now, the problem is that we always have to very narrowly define a problem for a machine to be able to solve it. But I feel like if we could come up with good methods for filtering massive data sets to just what might be relevant, it doesn't involve like trial and error.
Yes. So the thing must be that if you have a problem, how do you characterize it? How do you think, what kind of problem is this? And what method is good for that kind of problem? So I suppose that people vary a lot, and it's a great question. That's what the critics do. They say, what kind of problem is this? How do I recognize this particular predicament? And I wish there were some psychologists who thought about that the way Newell and Simon did, God, in the 1960s, it's 50 years ago. How many of you have seen that book called Human Problem Solving? It's a big, thick book, and it's got all sorts of chapters. That's the one I mentioned the other day, where they actually had some theories of human problem solving and simulated this. They gave subjects problems like this and said, we want you to figure out what numbers those are. And they lied to the subjects and said, this is an important kind of problem in cryptography. The secret agents need to know how to decode cryptograms of this sort, where usually it's the other way around. The numbers stand for letters, and there's some complicated coding, but these are simple cases. So you have to figure out that sort of thing. And then the book has various chapters on theories of how you recognize different kinds of problems and select strategies. And of course, some people are better than others. And believe it or not, at MIT, there was almost a whole decade of psychologists here who were studying the psychology of 5-person groups. It became, suppose you take 5 people and put them in a room and give them problems like this, or not the same cryptic, but little puzzles that require some cleverness to solve. And you record and video. They didn't have video in those days, so it was actual film. Yuck. And there's a whole generation of publications about the social and cognitive behavior of these little groups of people. They zeroed in on 5-person groups for reasons I don't remember, but it turned out that almost always when you had that, the group divided into 2 competitive groups with 2 and 3, and every now and then they would reorganize, but it was more a study in social relations than in cognitive psychology. But it's an interesting book, and there must be contemporary studies like that of how people cooperate, but I just haven't been in that environment. Any of you taken a psychology course recently? Not a one? Just wonder what's happened to general psychology. I used to sit in on Teuber and a couple of other lecturers here, and a psychology course was sort of like 20% optical illusions, and
yeah, they still do that.
Stuff like that.
They also concentrate a lot on developmental psychology.
Well, that's nice to hear, because I don't believe there was any of that in Teuber's class.
I think Professor Gabrielli now teaches the introductory psychology, and he.
Do they still believe Piaget, or do they think that he was wrong?
I think they probably take the same approach as with like Freud. They would say, great ideas in a revolution, but they also don't think he's the end of the.
Well, he got.
But I know plenty, like the childhood development class. You read Piaget, like.
Yeah, in Piaget's later years, he got algebra envy, and he wanted to be more scientific and studied logic and a few things like that, and became less scientific. It was sort of sad to. I can imagine being browbeaten by mathematicians because they're the ones who were getting published. And he only had, how many books did Piaget?
But if I may add a comment about Piaget here, that really comes from an old friend of many of us, Seymour. As you know, he was, of course, Piaget's mathematician for many years.
We got Papert from Piaget's lab.
But Seymour said that he felt that Piaget's best work was his early work, especially building on his case studies. And one time when we were talking about the issue of focusing from the AI lab, the work done in psychology here, Seymour said he felt that was less necessary than more of a concentration on AI, because he expected in the future the world of study of the mind would separate into two individual studies. One much more biological, like the neurosciences of today, and the other focused more on the structure of knowledge and on representations and, in effect, the genetic epistemology of Piaget. And he added that something that was a quote later he made was that even if Piaget's marvelous theory of today proved to be wrong, he would ensure that whatever replaced it will be a theory of the same sort, one of the development of knowledge and all its changes. So I don't think people will get away from Piaget however much they want to.
I don't think so either. I meant to introduce our visitor here because Bob Lohler here has reproduced a good many of the kinds of studies that Piaget did in the 1930s and 40s. And if you look him up on the web, you must have a few papers.
Actually, I better tell you what the website is because it's still hidden from web crawlers. It's nlcsa.net.
That would be hard to.
Natural Learning Case Study Archive.net. It's still in process, still in development, but it's worth looking at now.
How many children did Piaget have?
Well, Piaget had 3 children
So
whose
did you.
development he studied. But what he did was to mix together the information from all 3 studies in support of the ideas with which he began. So it was illustrations of his theories.
Anyway, Bob has quite a lot of studies about how his children developed concepts of number and geometry and things like that. And I don't know of anyone else since Piaget who's continued to do those sorts of experiments. There were quite a lot at Piaget's Institute in Geneva for some years after Piaget was gone, but I think it's pretty much closed now, hasn't it?
Well, the last psychologist that Piaget hired was Jacques Lanesh, who was no longer at the university. He retired, and it has been taken over by the neo-Piagetians who are doing something different.
Is there any other place? Well, there was
there are people
Yoichi's lab on children in Japan.
There are many people who take Piaget seriously, and in this country as well as others.
So Robert mentioned that Feynman had like more representations of the world than like usual people. When I talked about Einstein and the glial cells, I refer to that because I believe K-lines is a way of representing the world, and maybe Einstein had like better ways of representing the world. And I believe that, for example, agents and resources are not different from Turing machines. You can create a very simple like Turing machine that act like agents and you have some mental states. But there is no, I believe, good way of right now of representing the world and like updating this representation of the world. Like it seems to me that when you grow up, you're learning like how to represent the world better and better, and you have some layers, and that's all about K-lines. And if glial cells are actually like related to K-lines, so it means that Einstein like had like a better hardware in representing the world, and that's why he would be smarter than other people.
Well, it's hard to I'm sure that that's right, that you have a certain amount of hardware, but you can reconfigure some of it. Nobody really knows, but some brain centers may have only a few neurons, and maybe if they're maybe there's some retrograde signals, so that if two brain centers are simultaneously activated, then usually the signals only go one way from one to the other. Have to go through a third one to get back. But it could be that the brain, that the neurons have a property that if two centers are activated, maybe that causes more connections to be made between them that can then be programmed more. I don't think anybody really has a clear idea of whether you can grow new connections between brain centers that are far apart. Does anybody know? Is there anything?
Common knowledge that there was no such thing as adult neurogenesis, and now it is known that it exists in certain limited regions of the brain. So in the future, it may be known that it exists everywhere.
Right, or else that those experiments were wrong, and they were in a frog rather than a person.
That you could take a frog's brain out and stick it in backwards, and pretty soon it would behave just like it used to.
Marvin said?
Yeah. Of course, I don't know if he was kidding or not. You never could tell.
You could never tell when he was kidding. Letvin was a neuroscientist here who was sort of one of the great all-time neuroscientists. He was also one of the first scientists to use transistors for biological purposes and made circuits that are still used in every laboratory. So he was a very colorful figure, and everyone should read some of his older papers. I don't know that there were any recent ones, but he had an army of students who, and he was extremely funny. What else?
Continuing on the idea of hardware versus software, what do you think about the idea that like intelligences or humans may need strong instincts as when they're born in order, like, and the interplay between their instincts, like they know to cry when they're hungry or to look for their mother, and they need these instincts in order to develop higher orders of knowledge.
You'd have to ask L. Ron Hubbard for. I don't recall any real attempts to I don't think I've ever run across any buddy claiming to have correlations between prenatal experience and the development of intelligence.
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when, before intelligence is really developed, like you learn language, before you learn language, you need to have a motivation to do something. So you need to have instinctual reactions to things. And by accumulation of experiential knowledge, after you're born,
Well, children learn language, 12 to 18 months. And what are you saying, that they need some preparation? I'm not sure what you're asking.
So, take it from an engineering point of view. If you were to build like a robot, would you need to program it with some instincts, some like rule of thumb algorithms in order to get it started in the world, in order to build experiential knowledge?
You might want to build something like a difference engine so that you can represent a goal and it will try to achieve it. So you need some engine for producing any behavior at all.
Right, so if you're, like, if you take the approach that, like, maybe to build an AI, you should build like an infant robot, and then you teach it as you would like a human child, then would it be useful to make it dependent on like some mother figure in order to help it learn how to do things like a human child would?
Well, in order to learn, you have to learn from something. And one way to learn is in isolation, just to have some, you could build a goal to predict what will happen. And the best way to predict, as Alan Kay put it once, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So you could make or you could put a model of an adult in it to start with, so that, in other words, one way to make a very smart child is to copy its mother's brain into a little subbrain when it's born, and then it could learn from that instead of depending on anybody else. I'm not sure. You have to start with something. Of course, humans, as Bob mentioned, or someone mentioned, if you take a human baby and isolate it, it looks like it won't develop language by itself, because I don't know what because. But in fact, I remember one of our children who had just learning to talk, and she said, something came up, and she said, "What because is that?" And do you remember? It took a while to get her to say why. So when she would come up and say, "What because?" and I would say, "You're asking why did this?" After a long time, she got the hint, but why do all WH words start with WH?
One of them doesn't. How?
How? Could you say, wow? How? Is there a theory?
Not that I know.
It's a basic sound telling that you're making a query before you can do the rising inflection. It's interesting. Is it true in French? Quoi? Well, the land of the silent letter. Anybody know what's the equivalent of WH words in your native language?
N.
What?
N.
N?
Yeah.
In what? Really? They all start with N? Wow. Interesting. Maybe the infants have an effect on something. Do questions in Turkish end with a rise?
Yeah.
Is it rising?
Well, so only the WH questions. Okay, all questions end in a kind of an inflection, but normally you have a little word that you would put at the end of any sentence to make it into a question. Except for the WH questions, which are standalone words.
Right.
You don't need the.
Yes, you say, this is expensive. And they don't need the WH if you do enough of that. Huh. So the question is that in the brain at birth?
Is that pattern mirrored in English where you can say, is
rising intonation mirrors the using a separate word, but you don't need that separate word if it's an EN word.
But if you're saying how expensive is this without the question of inflection, it almost sounds like you're making a statement about just how ridiculously expensive it is. You know, like if you're going, how expensive is this?
Yes.
Versus how expensive is this?
Well, I should let you go.